In Magic, permanents enter the battlefield untapped unless they say otherwise. Oftentimes, they have permanents enter the battlefield tapped when they want to weaken a powerful card, and this can be particularly effective with creatures, because if one enters tapped, that often effectively means that you didn't add anything to the board for a full turn, since your brand new creature won't be able to block. As far as your opponent is concerned, your board state hasn't changed a whole lot until your next untap step. However, because they use this ability to power down a creature, creatures that enter tapped do actually tend to be pretty powerful, and they're often very capable of overcoming the downside. To be eligible for this video, a creature has to enter the battlefield tapped, no matter when you play it. This means cards like Eddy Merc, Crab, and Horned Lockwhale are excluded, since they only enter tapped when you cast them on your opponent's turn. In all, there were 57 cards eligible for this video, and in it we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Lumbering Megasloth. For 10 generic and 2 green, it's an 8/8 trampler that enters tapped, but it costs 1 generic less to cast for each counter among players in permanents. Unlike most counter payoffs, the Megasloth counts the total number of counters and looks at both players' boards, so it's surprisingly easy to lower its mana cost in the right deck, like all the way down to 2 green mana. So because this is often a 2 mana 8/8 trampler, it seems pretty fair that it enters tapped. It's also a nice touch flavor-wise, since sloths are slow. Lumbering Megasloth is from Universes Beyond Fallout, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage, and it's seeing play in the former in Dark Depths decks. As you can probably guess from the deck being named for it, the deck is all about getting Dark Depths into play, and then getting the 2020 avatar out of it as soon as possible, oftentimes using Thespian Stage. The Megasloth gives the deck another win condition, since if Dark Depths is in play with its 10 counters, you only have to spend 2 green to get the Sloth into play, and this is extra doable thanks to Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, which even makes Dark Depths capable of producing green mana. The Megasloth hasn't caught on in every Dark Depths deck in Legacy, but it's also pretty likely to gain at least a few more points, and that's probably going to be enough for it to claim a higher spot on the list. At number 9, it's Cult Conscript. The first of several black 1-drops on this list that enter tapped, Cult Conscript is a 1 mana 2/1, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, but you can activate that only if a non-skeleton creature died under your control this turn. Wizards of the Coast likes designing black 1-drops that enter tap, and that's especially true when they have the ability to return from the graveyard. By making something like this enter tapped, it means you can't just keep bringing it back and blocking forever. You know how powerful that can be if you've ever played against Cauldron Familiar. But if you do drop this on turn 1, there's a good chance that it entering tapped doesn't even matter. It's been played in Standard and Pioneer aggro decks, usually in decks that have either a graveyard or sacrifice sub-theme, as that lets you get the most mileage out of the Conscript's recursion. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since the first half of 2024. At number 8, it's Tormented Hero, which has the same mana cost and stat line as Cult Conscript. It's a 1 mana 2/1 that enters tapped, and it has a heroic trigger, which means it does something when you cast a spell that targets it. In this case, your opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. While we get 1 mana 2/1s with no downside all the time these days, that was significantly less common back in 2013 when this was printed, so having this enter tapped was a way to make this creature a little less good, especially because it has some very real upside in the form of its Drain Life effect. Overall, the hero is a very aggressive creature with good stats that can also pressure the opponent's life total when you use combat tricks or put auras on it. It almost feels like pseudo lifelink. As with other 1 mana cards that enter tapped, entering tapped is less frequently a downside, since if you play it on turn 1, especially if you're on the play, it doesn't really make a difference. But as with most of the cards on this list, drawing this when you really need a blocker feels pretty brutal. Unsurprisingly, the hero was played in black aggro decks when it was in Standard, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2014. At number 7, it's Watcher for Tomorrow. It's 1 generic and a blue for a 2/1 with Hideaway 4, and it enters tapped. Hideaway 4 means you look at the top 4 cards of your library and exile one of them with Watcher for Tomorrow. While tapping used to actually be part of the Hideaway mechanic itself, the mechanic did recently get revamped, and the Watcher now enters tapped as a result of a separate ability. When it leaves the battlefield, you can put the exiled card into the owner's hand. Having this enter tapped is very relevant since your opponent is likely to be hesitant about giving you whatever card you exiled, but they don't have to worry about you blocking with the Watcher on that first turn. Still, even with the downside, you're talking about a 2-1 that probably draws you a very good card when it leaves the battlefield, and it's likely to be a very good card because you get to pick the best one from among those top 4. And importantly, he triggers when he leaves the battlefield in any way, and not just when he dies. The Watcher is from Modern Horizons, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and it's been played in both Modern and Legacy. In Modern, it's been played in decks that are adept at blinking creatures with Soul Herder and Ephemerate. Those types of decks can get you the card under the Watcher and set it up to Hideaway all over again. In Legacy, it's put up top 8s in Food Chain combo decks. These decks generally try to go off using the powerful enchantment by combining it with Eternal Scourge and Mist Hollow Griffin. Those creatures can be cast from exile, so when you exile them to Food Chain, you can simply cast them again and net a mana every time you do. You can repeat this loop until you have 1 million mana, then the deck can win with an X creature like Walking Ballista, which just machine guns the opponent to death. Watcher for Tomorrow is nice in this style of deck because of its ability to dig 4 deep into your deck to find your combo pieces. If you've already got Food Chain around, you can also immediately exile the Watcher for some mana and draw the card it's hiding. And should it hit the Scourge or the Griffin, you can cast them from Hideaway without ever having the Watcher get exiled. The Watcher isn't actively putting up points in Legacy right now, and its last top 8 in Modern came in the first half of 2024, but it is undoubtedly strong in the right deck and it may find a new home in the future. At number 6, it's Sleep Cursed Faerie. For 1 blue mana, it's a 3/3 with flying and ward 2. That's an insanely good creature for only 1 mana. While the stats and flying are great, don't underestimate ward 2. Because this is so cheap, it makes it virtually impossible for your opponent to ever remove the Faerie efficiently. So the stats and keywords are so good that this Faerie goes extra hard in entering the battlefield tapped, since it enters tapped with 3 stun counters. This means anytime it would untap, you remove a stun counter instead. So it's not just going to be tapped for 1 turn like the other cards on the list. Well, not usually at least. The Faerie also comes with an ability that costs 1 generic and a blue that can untap the Faerie. This means you can use it to remove stun counters, and once it's not stunned anymore, it also has pseudo-vigilance. While it's a relatively new card, Sleep Cursed Faerie has already seen play in 4 different formats, usually in tempo decks, which like the idea of playing a threat on turn 1 and leaving up interaction on subsequent turns. Then, if your opponent doesn't do something for you to react to, you can remove a counter, and eventually you end up with this flyer. In Standard, it's sometimes played in Dimir tempo decks, some of which have Faerie payoffs to get some extra mileage out of Sleep Cursed Faerie. In Modern and Legacy, it started showing up in Delver of Secrets tempo decks, where it gives the deck a second 1-drop that starts as something kind of insignificant, but then grows into an absolutely massive threat later in the game. While it often takes a little longer for it to become a threat than it takes for Delver of Secrets, it's also much easier to protect Sleep Cursed Faerie thanks to Ward. Sleep Cursed Faerie is going to continue to put up top 8s in multiple formats, and is very likely to claim a higher spot on this list in the future. Speaking of Sleep Cursed Faerie, don't sleep on this channel. If you're enjoying the content I put out, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, and I'd really appreciate it if you help me get there. At number 5, it's Diregraf Ghoul. This one is very straightforward because it's simply 1 black mana for a 2/2 that enters tapped. 1 mana 2/2s typically come with some downside, but as with other 1-drops that enter tapped, the downside is often minimal, and you get a great aggressive creature out of the deal. It also helps that it has the zombie creature type, as that was a very well-supported creature type when Diregraf Ghoul was in Standard. The most notable payoff it was played with was Gravecrawler, which you could cast from the graveyard if you had a zombie in play. Diregraf Ghoul hasn't put up any top 8 since its first run through Standard, this in spite of reprints in Core Set 2019 and Foundations. A 1 mana 2/2 with downside isn't as good as it used to be, but Foundations will be in Standard for a very long time, and if there's ever enough zombie support, Diregraf Ghoul could potentially find itself top 8ing some more events in the future. At number 4, it's Gutterbones. For 1 black mana, it's a 2/1 that enters tapped, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to your hand, but you can only activate that ability during your turn, and only if an opponent lost life this turn. Yet another black 1-drop that enters tapped. This one does so to help balance the fact that it's super easy for aggro decks to return it to their hand. A creature like this makes it a lot harder for any aggro deck to run out of gas, because if they reach a point where they don't have any more creatures in hand, they can just start bringing back Gutterbones and pressuring the opponent. While in Standard it was played in Rakdos and Mono Black aggro, it's also seen some play in Pioneer Mono Black aggro, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2021. At number 3, it's Traxos Scourge of Kroog. This big legendary artifact creature has an impressive stat line as it's a 7/7 trampler that only costs 4 generic mana. To balance out its massive size, not only does it enter tapped, it also doesn't untap during your untap step. However, it can untap anytime you cast a historic spell, which includes artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So if your deck has a lot of those things, you can get around the downside and even turn it into a bit of upside in some scenarios, since you can untap it more often than just during your untap step. While it saw a bit of play in Standard and Pioneer, Traxos has done the most work by far in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage. In that format, dropping Traxos on turn 1 is very doable thanks to the presence of Mishra's Workshop and a plethora of other fast mana, and Workshop decks are loaded up with artifacts, so it's basically always going to untap on your next turn and smash in for 7, and it even plays offense and defense at the same time pretty well, since it gains pseudo-vigilance in a deck with that many artifacts. Traxos isn't exactly a staple in Shop's decks, but it does see play in some of them, so it's pretty likely to add to its score in the future. At number 2, it's Dread Wanderer, a card that bears a striking resemblance to the number 4 card, Gutterbones. Both are 1 black mana for a 2/1 that enters tapped, and both have conditional recursive abilities. In the case of the Wanderer, you can return it from the graveyard to the battlefield by paying 2 generic and a black, but you can only activate that ability as a sorcery, and only if you have 1 or fewer cards in hand. Dread Wanderer is older than Gutterbones and filled the same type of role in Standard decks, where it was an aggressive 1-drop that you could bring back when you ran out of gas. In most ways, the Wanderer is better, since it returns directly to the battlefield and has a requirement that is generally easier to access. That's why the Wanderer has a significantly higher score and why it's been played more in Pioneer. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since 2022, and it's likely Traxos passes it in the future. And at number 1, it's Geralf's Messenger. For 3 black, it's a 3/2 that enters tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent loses 2 life. It also has Undying, which means that when it dies, if it has no +1/+1 counters on it, you return it to the battlefield under your control with a +1/+1 counter on it. In other words, for a total investment of 3 mana, you get a 3/2 and a 4/3 that makes your opponent lose 4 total life. That's a pretty amazing return on the investment, so it's not too surprising that they decided to have it enter tapped. A creature that can come back once for free would normally be a pretty good blocker, but entering tapped makes it significantly worse. It saw a ton of play in Standard, where zombie decks had tons of support. These decks often also used Birthing Pod and Mortar Pod, which could get some extra value out of Geralf's extra body. Geralf's Messenger has also been very successful in Modern. Initially, it was played in Jund mid-range decks that were all about generating 2-for-1s, and obviously that's exactly what Geralf's Messenger is all about. It was a pretty sweet hit off of Bloodbraid Elf's Cascade. After the elf got banned in 2013 though, the Messenger didn't have a home in Modern for several years. That all changed with the release of Modern Horizon in 2019. That set contained Yawgmoth Thran Physician, which can combo off with the Messenger. If you use Yawgmoth's ability to put a -1/-1 counter on the Messenger when it has a +1/+1 counter, the two cancel each other out. So, if you have another creature with Undying in play, you can just endlessly loop the sacrifice effect that puts a -1/- counter on one of them until Geralf's Messenger's Enter the Battlefield ability lowers your opponent's life to 0. There are modern toolbox decks built around comboing off like this, and while the release of Modern Horizons 3 seems to have made this deck a lot less prevalent, the Messenger is still likely to add to its score in the future, solidifying its position as the best creature in Magic that enters a battlefield tapped. So, those are the best creatures that enter the battlefield tapped. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at mechanics, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.